High cholesterol leading to clogged arteries, heart disease, cancer, or heart attack is one of the most common questions that we've gotten in the last few weeks. So let's talk about that. I have fond memories as a kid of listening to the radio while working at my father's shop. As I was tinkering away on repairs or restocking shelves in the storefront, one of my favorite radio shows to listen to was Paul Harvey and his segment, The Rest of the Story. He'd always start by telling you where things had ended up for someone or how something had come to be. Oftentimes, simple facts we'd all collectively learned a long time ago. Then, in his jovial musical voice, he'd croon, "Now, the rest of the story," and proceed to tell you the significant backstory and events that preceded the obvious facts we all took for granted. Now, I'm no Paul Harvey, but I'm going to try to do something similar today with this question. If you ever wondered if high cholesterol is the alleged culprit behind heart attacks, why do 50% of heart attack victims exhibit lower than average LDL cholesterol levels? If saturated fats from meat is considered hazardous, why do tribes thriving on an entirely animal-based diet not only survive, but flourish? How does Hong Kong, with the highest meat consumption per capita, boast the longest life expectancy globally? Why, despite dietary recommendation compliance since the 1960s, has there been an alarming increase in obesity, heart disease, strokes, cancer, and other modern ailments? We've been told that heart disease, cardiac arrest, diabetes, stroke, and a whole host of other diseases are closely linked or even caused by high cholesterol. We've been told to limit meat consumption, to eat lean meat, low in saturated fat, and to increase plant-based foods in our diet since the 1960s. And yet, what has been the outcome of this advice? Everything has gotten worse since then. Now, I'm not a genius, but something doesn't add up here. Why, if we're following the USDA dietary recommendations, are we not seeing improvements in these diseases? But instead, we as a populace are getting sicker and sicker in spite of spending more money on medicine and research than any other country. We're number one for heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. In order to answer these questions and get to the bottom of this, we have to take a little stroll down memory lane. In fact, we have to go back further than any of us probably can remember. Now, the rest of the story. In the decades between the 1940s and the 1960s, the post-World War II agriculture boom led to the emergence of massive food corporations. Coinciding with this, rising concerns about cardiac issues, diabetes, and cancer spurred studies to be conducted which initially pointed to sugar and carbohydrates as the culprits behind these diseases. In a bid to protect their interests, sugar and grain companies orchestrated a multi-pronged attack involving subterfuge, lies, and manipulation of scientific studies. We learned in 2015 from the Journal of the American Medical Association about actual internal memos from sugar companies back from the 40s and 50s, talking about studies that were coming out which showed that sugar was the cause of heart disease, something that before this time was not very prevalent. For obvious reasons, sugar companies wanted to cover this up. In their own documentation, they said that they paid 3 Harvard professors to falsify data and publish fraudulent studies in order to make it appear as though cholesterol was causing heart disease, when in fact, it was really sugar. This act of deception exonerated sugar and made red meat and eggs high in saturated fat the scapegoats of a disease that has only continued to increase in prevalence since then and sends millions of people to an early grave. Initially, the cause of heart disease was a hotly debated topic, with some doctors and researchers blaming sugar, while others claimed it was really meat and eggs. Then, one of those Harvard professors hired to engage in falsifying studies and pushing the fraudulent data that saturated fat causes heart disease was named the head of the USDA in 1965. Immediately after, the USDA declared that saturated fat increases cholesterol and that cholesterol causes heart disease. They shut down the debate and ruined the careers of honest scientists and doctors who stood by the sound scientific data. The entire argument of this propaganda masquerading as science said that meat and eggs were bad because they contain high levels of cholesterol, while fruit, grain, and vegetables were heart healthy. The entire argument was this doesn't have fat, therefore it's not bad for you. Since then, Americans and other people from around the world who followed the falsified studies and fraudulent health guidance reduced fat by 33%, meat by 30%, and increased fruit by 30% and vegetables by 40%. Sugar has increased to the point now that a child today has more sugar by the time they are 8 years old than the average person in the 1800s ate in their entire life. And what have been the results? Obesity rates have tripled, heart disease tripled, strokes tripled, cancer rates have tripled, type 2 diabetes and autoimmune disorders, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and developmental delays such as autism have all increased exponentially. Most of these diseases almost didn't exist until the 1900s, and now they're the primary disease that we deal with in our modern age. There are lots of studies that came out since 2015 that have had hundreds of thousands of patients where they looked at LDL cholesterol in relationship to heart attacks, strokes, and other coronary diseases. For anyone who doesn't know, LDL has historically been branded the bad cholesterol. However, these recent studies show that those patients with higher LDL cholesterol from saturated fat in meat and eggs had less heart attacks and fewer strokes when compared to people with lower LDL cholesterol. They were also less likely to develop Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and dementia. Meanwhile, those who followed the heart-healthy, low-fat diets were at higher risk of their brains decaying and their mental faculties diminishing. These studies actually showed that heart and brain health were protected by the LDL cholesterol and long-chain fatty acids in saturated fats. Ancel Keys, an incredibly influential scientist and researcher, authored the 7 Nations study and developed the recommended daily values. He concluded that cardiovascular disease was directly linked to high cholesterol. We now know Ancel Keys was bought and paid for by big food and ag corporation interests. The Framingham study, still a keystone study for cardiologists today, concluded and reported a correlation between high total cholesterol and greater risk of cardiovascular disease. However, their own data showed the higher your cholesterol, the more protected you were from cardiovascular disease. Recent studies show that it's not LDL itself, but versions of LDL which come from sources other than meat and eggs, which are dangerous. SDLDL and VLDL are smaller particulate sizes of LDL which come from alcohol and fructose. These forms of cholesterol are very dangerous, and they cause glycation damage to our cells, hardening and calcifying the plaque in our arteries, and are known to lead to coronary heart disease. Although many doctors and scientists who stuck to their guns and refused to back down from the claims that sugar and carbs were to blame for heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, have since started to become vindicated by recent studies. Most of them have not lived to see that vindication for themselves. They, like unsung heroes of this epic, refused to propagate lies and sacrificed everything for their patients and the truth. In spite of this, biased studies continue to come out, pushing big food and big ag's agendas and propaganda. Just recently, a study came out showing that peanut M&Ms were actually healthier than beef and pork, if you believe that. The fight for the wallet and the mind of the American people continues. On one hand, the health and lives of the populace are at stake. On the other hand, massive billion-dollar fortunes are at stake. But for those of us who know, for those of us who have seen the receipts, we can't unsee them. No matter how bad the ridicule and slander is, we cannot be fooled or deceived anymore. Only now you know the rest of the story.